Hello, welcome. That's right, I'm back. 2 weeks gone, and now you're forced to suffer my voice again. Here we go with World War One, the Russian Revolution. MC, where do you want to start? Do you want to start about Rasputin's hold upon the Tsarina,
Well,
or
this
do
is,
you wanna just go straight into the meat of things?
I mean, we talked about Rasputin and so forth, but the thing about Rasputin, to be honest, while it's great copy and it's great fodder, okay, and it did have a slight effect, okay, for from the Russian Revolution standpoint, it really didn't affect things the way you think it did. Not from the Russian Revolutionary standpoint. It affected the Tsar's internal government with him dealing with the rest of the nobility, okay, but for the most part, the average person couldn't give a rat's ass about Rasputin.
Ah, see, there you go. The average person. See, this was the peasants' revolution, was it not?
Well, okay, yes and no. All right, the thing is as the war drags on, okay, the thing to remember is the Tsar and the military, they put 16 million men under arms. Okay, 16 million men, and they couldn't feed them. And how did they feed them? They took all the food from the countryside, so the populace was starving. Okay, and at the same time, you put 16 million men total under arm, and they lost 5.5 million of them in battle. Right, either due to either being killed or basically being captured. That's a third of your military force being killed or captured on the battlefield. Okay, and as the war dragged on, okay, now Tsar Nicholas, all right, and this is a picture of Tsar Nicholas and Alexandria, all right, his wife. Okay, as the war drags on, all right, there's things to remember. Now this is an interesting picture. Okay, let's go back. This is Nicholas. Okay, and if you take a look here, this is a picture of Nicholas right here. Who's this? Farty?
One man. It's the Tsar and his brother, isn't it?
Nope. That's King George.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, they're related.
Yes, they are. This is the King of England. Okay, and when we talked about earlier on in the World War I stream, we mentioned the fact that these royals were all related. It's not an exaggeration. They were all related. Okay, Nicholas didn't want this war. Nicholas wasn't understood that his country wasn't prepared for the war. All right. Unfortunately, Nicholas is part of the aristocracy, and the aristocracy wanted the battle. The aristocracy wanted war. The Russian aristocracy wanted to go to war, and they saw this as a great opportunity. All right, now, and that from that perspective, yeah, Rasputin plays a role because the aristocracy absolutely hated Rasputin. They're the ones who actually killed him. Okay.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. Okay, the Tsar didn't want the war. The King of England didn't really want the war either. So why did they have war?
Well, because they're not as much as people think of them as autocrats. They're not as autocratic. There are limitations on what they can do and what they can't do. Okay, and while they may not want war, these two allies may not war. The Austro-Hungarians wanted war. Okay, the Austro-Hungarians did want to punish Serbia. They were all about it. All right, and the Germans, while they were not spoiling for a fight, they were looking for an opportunity as well. Many of the people in many of the German hierarchy. All right, the Kaiser may not have wanted it per se, but there was a number of his leaders that they felt that sooner or later they were going to have to deal with the French, and sooner or later they're going to have to deal with the Russian threat anyway. All right, so we might as well do it now. And they thought they were in a good position. They really did. All right. Now, did it work out for them? Of course not. So as the war drags on, two things happen. First of all, you end up with, and this is his family. Okay, I forgot to tell you this. This is his daughters and his son. Okay. Let me go back and show this a little bit. I just wanted the people to remember that, you're not just talking about nobodies here, right? There are actual people that died because of this, right? I mean, he truly was a doting father, right? And unfortunately, they're all gonna. We all know what's gonna happen as the war drags on. All right, things are becoming dire, but it's becoming dire for a number of individuals. Okay, for example, the Germans are beginning to suffer deprivations as well. Not to the degree that the Russian peasantry is and the people, because the bread lines and everything are having effect. Okay, but there's something else that we haven't talked about, and that is this whole communist underpinning in World War I, because it affects every single nation.
And just on this picture here, right, we know the guy on the left is Joseph Stalin, the guy on the right is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but this monkey in the fucking middle, he's one of the bigger protagonists in this, and he's Leon Trotsky.
Yeah, he is basically Lenin's right-hand man. All right. Now, Lenin and I believe Trotsky as well. Both Lenin and Trotsky had been expelled from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They were no longer allowed in Russia. The Germans, however, in fact, they were in jail in Germany for their activities. And the Germans said, you know what? We can help destabilize Russia by sending these two clowns back to Russia. And in a secret railroad car, they actually send them back into Russia to destabilize the Russian populace, to try and knock Russia out of the war. Because Russia is now gotten to the point where it is back to General Winter is going to save it for them. They're basically trading lives for land, and they're constantly pulling back, which is the standard Russian tactic. They're finally at that point. The great movements of troops anymore, they've given up on that because it's just too devastating. And it's affecting their entire military. Now, you're going to say something, Farney?
Yeah, and part of the reason how the Germans figured this out was because, like Adolf Hitler with Mein Kampf, Leon Trotsky was writing shit in prison. He was sending out letters, and basically, I made mention of this before, where the communists were getting into places of work, into French units, and everybody's ear pretty much saying down with this bourgeoisie and all this kind of stuff. Why are you fighting for them? Why are you working for them for a pittance? They're sitting up there like fat cats and all this. Workers unite and all this, and it's working. It's working all over the world. And the Germans are like, hey, this prick might be useful.
Well, no, and when Stalin breaks onto the scene, isn't he the one that goes from village to village and recruits the peasantry into the Red Army, pretty much?
Well, that's when he's trying to save the Reds. Okay, we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, but the thing to remember when we say this is worldwide, if you don't understand what we're talking about, take a look and look up the Wobblies. All right, in the United States, the Wobblies, the World Workers Union.
Or the Labor Party in most of the Commonwealth, because like the Labor Party doesn't mean like Labor is in, women giving birth. It's Labor is in physical labour, the Workers' Party.
Right.
And they basically can't call themselves communist in the Commonwealth because, well, then they'd be booted out by the Queen. So they're basically they're for the workers, the people, the People's
Right.
Party.
But there have been a number of in the United States during this time frame. There's a number of strikes. Okay, and they are put down by the Wobblies, and they are put down, and they are put down brutally. Out here, for example, in Arizona, all right, there was a miners' strike. Okay, it was put down. All right, and when I mean put down, I mean put down, where people came in there, busted heads, and said, "Get back to work or else." Now they wouldn't have done that if the other strike breaking techniques weren't effective. For example, one of the strike breaking techniques that was often used, it's very simple, is you bring in people from all over to replacement. You bring in what they call scabs, right? People that are going to go in there. Well, the problem with being a scab is when you leave, there's some union workers ready to beat your ass.
And not only that, you can't get work in a unionised place when you're being known as a scab. You basically it's like being drummed out of Hollywood.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's really more of the latter part of where we're at today. But back then, all right, that was a standard technique for breaking these strikes. Is they'd bring in people who wanted to work, and what they were waiting for is exactly for that violence. Because as soon as the union started the violence, they would bring in these companies would bring in private companies like the Pinkertons, all right, who would go in there and basically, you want violence? We'll show you violence. And it got violent very fast, very quick. There was a longshoreman strike, I think, in Seattle, all right, that was just absolutely brutal. You can look it up, right, as part of the Wobblies, all right. So when these guys were agitating, when I say that they're agitating around the world, I'm saying they're agitating completely around the world. Now, they hadn't made, until the war, believe it or not, they hadn't made a hell of a lot of influence in Russia. And the reason for that is very simple. Russians were peasants, all right? I mean, I hate to say this. This was the average Russian. Okay? When you start talking about workers and working for the man, working for the company and so forth, well, that's great. But if you're just a serf on land, what appeals to you? Okay, there's not much that can appeal to you by communism. You got to remember the problem with communism. As a serf, the land is still yours. The land is still, you're tied to the land. You are part of the land. Okay. Now the government is coming in there and taking all of your food, granted, but I mean, as a whole, what are the communists going to say? Well, we're going to take all the land. Well, the peasants weren't really, they weren't really, cotton to that at this point. Okay. The war is what.
They had a turn up on the dinner table. They were happy.
Well, I mean, they were just, they're a hardy group of people, right? There are a number of things that happened as a result of this, but where they were making headway, of course, is in the big cities. In the big cities of Alexandria and, St. Petersburg. I'm sorry, I said Alexandria. I meant St. Petersburg and Moscow is where the communists had held a lot of sway. Okay, but the deprivations of the people at this point, like I said, they're trying to feed the military. You got 16 million men under arms, right? You got where 10 million are left, all right? You still got to feed those 10 million soldiers. Those 10 million soldiers that used to be on these farms. They used to be here, working the fields. They're no longer working the fields. They're basically in uniform. And their families, that's a major reduction in the capability for food support. Their families are starving, as well as the government is taking every ounce of food they can to try and feed the army. And it's a disaster.
Well, it is a disaster, but also where the communists really got involved was the Navy. We had talked about that before, but we should elaborate on it now because
Okay.
that's their first inroads, really, when it comes to the military.
Well, it's not their first inroads, but it's their first real success. Okay, and this is a picture of a party, a communist party in the naval yards in the Black Sea. This is where they develop their strength. All right, a good portion of their strength, and this is the sailors are all getting together, and they're basically telling the officers, who most of them have their rank, not because they were good officers, not because they came up and learned to be sailors, but because, quite frankly, they were nobility and they were given it. So the incompetence of the sailors, the leadership is a major reason why people were saying, okay, we can't handle this anymore. We're just not gonna listen to our officers, and they basically overthrew their officers and sat down.
And when you got these communists going, it's okay to do that because, like, they're not going to die for you. You know, you're dying for them. You know, why should you? You know, do as we say. You know, life will be better. And another instance of where they make inroads too is because Russia is starting to industrialize a lot more because of the war, and because of this, you know, a lot of communists and all this kind of stuff have already been employed in these kinds of workspaces. So that virus has already infected that element of Russia as well.
Right, so they're kind of uniquely placed, and sending Lenin and Trotsky back to Russia leads to the first part of the Russian Revolution, which leads to this. Right, basically, people protesting in the streets, wanting food because there needs to be food. So the people, as in mass, start protesting. And let me probably blow this up a little bit here. This is Lenin at one of his rallies, and I believe this is in Moscow, right, where he's telling everybody, you know, that he's got the plan, and they're going to share all the food, and it's in some ways it's very similar. It's very reminiscent of the French Revolution. Okay, so he gets everybody together. How does the government respond? The government responds with this. All right, Tsar Nicholas actually orders the Cossacks to put the demonstrations down violently.
Blow that up a bit.
Okay.
So everyone can get the full atmosphere. So these are civilians being fired upon.
You can see they're laying in the streets because they're dead. Okay, the Cossacks came through and just do what Cossacks were trained to do, which is they are the enemy. You mow the enemy down, and you'll notice these people are they're just getting killed. All right, and they're running for their lives. Now, it's an effective technique if you want to think of it from that standpoint. I mean, it does its job. But believe it or not, this is what causes the major rift between the Tsar and the serfs, because the serfs up to that point still more or less supported the Tsar, not the Tsar's government, but the Tsar himself. But when he orders the Cossacks, all right, to come in, all right, there was a general fear of the Cossack troops, right? They looked upon them as bloodthirsty barbarians. And when they found out that Tsar Nicholas was the one who ordered them to do it, he lost all support. I mean, from the populace, because they're like, how dare you unleash these evil barbarians upon us? This was a demarcation point. Right, and it leads to the abdication of the Tsar, right, and his family. Now he abdicates. They create a Democrat type style government, okay, of which the communists are only a part, right, and they're a large part, but they're not the majority. So Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin keep agitating. Now, the one thing that they were successful in doing is they were successful in preventing the Tsarina and the Tsar's family from leaving. They placed them under house arrest. So they were under house arrest, even though he is abdicated now. Okay? They are afraid to let him go to one of the other nations. They are afraid to let him live, all right, without control. So they want to control him. So they want to keep control of his family because they're afraid that if he goes to Great Britain, he will eventually be able to come back into power. Okay? They greatly feared this, all right? So they never let him out. Now, the agitation continues because one of the problems that the new government tried to do is the new government kept trying to continue the war. And while they did replace a number of these horrible generals, the reality is that the problems within the Russian military at the time were not going to be fixed just because you changed generals. All right, the logistics was not going to get any better. All right, the training was not going to get any better. You needed to have something like an overhaul of the entire military as this was all collapsing. And what's worse is you have the communists, and the communists are just destabilizing everything everywhere. So even if you try to rally the units are being filled with communist freaking backstabbing fifth columnists. Eventually, Lenin is able to re-seize control and basically continue with it. All right, but this shows you some of the street fighting that went on. Okay, you were going to say something, Matt Dodge?
Well, yeah, and what they end up doing is they create committees within military units. So you no longer take orders from your sergeant. You guys discuss it first. MC and Farty both, you're military men. That doesn't work, does it?
Of course not.
Well, it kind of did work for him in World War II, but that's a different story, though.
Well, no. It was just that the commissar replaced the lieutenant. You had to follow what the commissar said, or you got shot. It was a very simple rule. So from that, nobody voted. The commissar didn't allow people to vote on what was the best policy. He told you what the policy was. Okay, so it wasn't quite the same at the time. At the time, they were trying to tell these guys, let's all vote on this. Let's have this, as small units. Let's vote on whether or not we want to go on the attack and so forth, and how we're going to go on the attack. And you can't do that. All right, the military doesn't function that way. It can't function that way. It can't function well. It can't function effectively without a top-down, top-driven mentality. Right? You can't train. You can't, sustain any kind of real combat in those regards. Okay, better than what Rockefeller did. He literally had his miners shot and killed by private militias. Just the way the libertarians want things.
Oh, ha ha ha! But no, the thing is though, when the committees started coming in, that was the end of the war for Russia. They ended up declaring an armistice. What, 4 or 5 months later?
I think it's 6 months later. It's it's like the beginning of 1918 that it becomes official. All right. Now the Allies at this point are trying to scramble to keep them in the war, but the Russian Revolution is just getting started. Now everyone thinks that the Russians, once they came out of the war, for them the war was over. Okay. That's just not the case, okay? Because Stalin had an immediate reaction. The people who, when Lenin took over, all right, and Lenin seized power, the first thing he did is he tried to seize control of everything. And there were people, of course, who were part of the government, as well as the nobility that's now been displaced, that were very upset with this. All right, and they raised an armed force to try and stop it. And so what you have is you have the white-red Russian combat, civil war take place, where the communists were actually battling other Russians, all right, to see who was in the end was going to end up being in power. But as far as the Germans was concerned, as the Russians are fighting themselves, fine, I no longer have to worry about that front. The communists also basically gave in all the territory that the Germans had taken. They basically didn't have to give any of it back. They just basically said, okay, these are where the lines are. This is where we're going to make the border. They basically gave the Germans everything that they needed, everything that they had won in the war. So what you're seeing now, though, is you're seeing the Russians start a civil war amongst themselves. And that's what this is. That's what these pictures are from. All right. That civil war actually lasts all the way till 1920. And yes, U.S. troops did participate in it, although not to the degree that other people think they did. All right. I mean, we did put in troops, but we actually didn't get in any battles that I know of. All right. Now, one of the things that I would like to point out is you can see how this is all after the fact. This is obviously a staged picture, okay, of the communists. Okay. Notice this moron. Do you think that he survived? All right. The one thing that the Russians did is one of the things that was definitely a threat to them was individuality. You can't allow for it. You got to stamp that out. You got to make sure that this doesn't continue. So they basically would go around when somebody would do something like this. This person would mysteriously disappear.
Well, this and the last photo here, I mainly got those two for the simple reason that to illustrate how full-on this civil war was. This wasn't just dudes with rifles sniping at each other from windows and stuff like that. They actually did have artillery pieces on the streets, at street corners, at close range. They had, and if you can see what they're standing on, it's actually an armoured car with turret-mounted machine guns and whatnot. And they were also posted on street corners and things like that to counteract these barricades that the civilians have been putting up as well. So it was, military with military weapons against mainly civilians and.
Well, initially it was, but then as the Civil War continues, it becomes basically the both sides have certain military units. It comes down to logistics. Okay. And in this case, whether you liked it or not, the communists who basically seized the means of production had the logistics internally. In order for the White Russians to continue the battle, they had to get their weapons, all right, from the Allies, all right, overseas. All right. So logistically, you can see where you're hampered all of a sudden very quickly. Okay. And the Russians basically win. I mean, the communists, rather, they basically win. So the effects of this aren't going to be fully known until after, until later on. But one thing that does happen is as the peace feelers start coming out from the Russians to the Germans, the British and the French are very well aware of this. And even though the Americans have entered the war, they are now doing whatever they can to try and plus up the Americans as fast as possible. But you got to remember, this is causing havoc in America too. Like I said, the Wobblies, there was a strike, right, with the Wobblies that was a couple of them, like the copper mines. The copper mines all got together to try and end copper production in the United States, right? So it just tells you just how dangerous some of these people looked at this and how this was viewed. Ajax comment about the miners, what the Rockefellers did. The private militias that they're talking about were basically the Pinkertons, and they were he was hardly the only ones who would hire that group of people. For example, Carnegie. Everybody remembers Carnegie Steel, U.S. Steel. There were some strikes early on that were broken up All right, that Carnegie brought in the Pinkertons to put an end to it. This is one of the reasons why the communist Emma Goldman had to flee the United States and run to Canada. All right, because she was causing problems. Now this was before the war even. Okay, so just to show you just how how widespread this was. It wasn't something that just happens. We talk about the revolution, the Russian Revolution, as if it's something that just came out of nowhere. Okay, but it really didn't. Okay, now one of the things that Stalin does, or Lenin does, several things Lenin immediately puts into place. Right, first thing he does is he attempts to create, collective farms. He basically says, okay, you're all the farmers. All the serfs, you're no longer a serf. Now you just work on the collective farm and go make food. And the starvation throughout Russia got worse because the Russian farmers were like, well, we don't own our production. You're taking everything. Why the hell should I make anything? I traded one landlord where at least I had an agreement of certain amount I got to keep. You're telling me you're taking it all, right? For the quote unquote good of the good of the people. And who are the people you're feeding? Well, you're trying to feed the people in the cities. Well, great for the people in the cities, but that isn't working for me. So starvation set in. So Lenin had to roll that back and said, okay, we're going to end the collective farming idea, and we're going to allow you to own your own farms where you individually can have your farms, and then all of a sudden farming production and food production sped back up, and actually toward the latter part of his life. All right, but starvation was endemic throughout Russia almost the entire time Lenin was in power. Right.
Well, no, and I do want. We're talking about the Russian Revolution. So, all right, what brought about the murder of the Tsar and his family?
Okay, that's a good question. The Tsar and his family, they were so terrified. The communists were so terrified that if they just released the Tsar and his family, that at some point he would become the focal point of the during the Civil War. He would become the focal point for the white Russians, all right, to start a counter-revolution to take back over. And Lenin himself personally orders the death of the Tsar and his entire family and entire line to remove any chance, all right, that someone could take back over and put a constitutional style type of monarchy back in place.
And that was the big thing about why the rumours about Anastasia surviving and all this kind of stuff persisted and all this, because of, there's still, the lineage is still there and, all this kind of stuff. But we now know that, she died as the same night as everyone else. But, that kind of stuff perpetuated.
They just ordered, and these were people that, Anastasia was what?
I think she was 11 or 12, something like that.
Yeah, she was very young. Just a young child, and they executed them. And then burned their body.
Do you believe that violence like that for political reasons is justified? And hear me out. You saw a lot of this in Roman times. Okay? They would handle it the same fucking way. Same in Greek time. Nowadays, we have a new moral standard. But they didn't necessarily have that, 100 years ago. Is that justified?
Okay, now that's a good question. And I'm going to be... And the answer to that is no, it's not morally justified. Because at that point in time, okay, the rest of the world looked upon that kind of regicide as something heinous. Okay? It's not morally justifiable in that kind of sense. The idea that somehow the Tsar who had abdicated, all right, was going to be able to get people back into power was more of a fevered, nightmarish dream that they were creating in their own minds.
Not necessarily. I'll challenge you here because Napoleon. Anybody?
Napoleon. What about Napoleon?
It's a different story.
Is it a different story? He
Yeah.
was kicked out. He was ostracized. He came back with an army and damn near conquered Europe.
Right, because the second group were not. You got to remember who Napoleon was. Napoleon Bonaparte was beloved by the military.
Yeah,
okay.
He treated the French army like royalty pretty much. Everything was great under Napoleon and all this kind of stuff. And as soon as Napoleon got booted the first time, the army suffered. Things weren't as good as what they were. And then basically, as he came back, he started meeting up with French units and going, "Hey, I'm back. Come with me, and everything will be great again." And that's basically how he came back into power.
Right.
This time around, like the damage has already been done by the communists. There was really no way in hell that the Tsar was going to get back any power.
How was the Tsar going to sit up there and influence the military? The military had no trust of the Tsar. He couldn't rely upon them. He couldn't rely upon the peasants. All right, anymore. Okay, the peasants were always a shield for him. Believe it or not, the peasants were always a shield for the Tsar, right, for the longest time. All right, but he no longer was. Once he released the Cossacks, and once that became widely spread that he would release the Cossacks on the people, they had no trust for him anymore. It broke that final trust that the serfs had toward that. So they had no, a love of bringing back the royal aristocracy or anything like that. And the communists knew it. The Leninists knew it. Now, you could say that he could become a focal point. He could become a rallying cry. But the reality is that Tsar Nicholas himself was not the kind of person that people were going to gravitate to on a natural basis. He wasn't a natural leader. All right. He didn't engender loyalty on a personal basis. Okay. He wasn't the charismatic kind of person that Napoleon was. Okay, so the idea that was a threat in any way, shape, or form, it was nonsense. And believe it or not, you already had examples where a number of royals had abdicated and then they went away and they never came back. There was already an established principle around things that when you abdicate, it's over. You don't get to come back. That had already been more or less established.
Even if he went into exile, say in France or even England or something like that, basically he'd just be a former dignitary that just so happens to be living here now, and that's it.
Right.
Okay.
Government in exile.
Let's go on to the murder. How did that play out?
Basically, the orders came down from Lenin that they need to be dealt with. All right. Now, Stalin was one of the ones that was advocating to do it. Actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Trotsky also? Mm-hmm. Really, it was Lenin initially was the one who was like, no, I don't want to kill the Tsar. Right? It's when they finally convinced him. The other two finally convinced him to kill the Tsar. That they actually went about it and did it. Well, Trotsky wanted. Okay, everyone talks about Trotsky as if Trotsky was this great guy. Okay, Trotsky was one of the people who wanted to take every freaking royal that was part of the Russian aristocracy, right, and put them against the wall and put a bullet in their head.
He was a fucking virus.
All right. Trotsky himself was an extraordinarily vicious man. Okay. Now, he wasn't personally vicious because he wasn't big enough. All right. But as far as his activities go, he was, in many ways, he was a murdering psychopath. Okay, he's not the great, grand, glorious. Everyone thinks about, when Stalin took over, how he basically kicked Trotsky out, and that basically eventually murders him in Mexico, and he's a martyr. Trotsky doesn't deserve martyr status in any way, shape, or form. All right, but he eventually convinces Lenin to get rid of them. So they march in. They basically take all the kid, all the family, and they basically shoot them gangland style, very very reminiscent of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and then basically burn the bodies.
Yeah, they basically put them in a room, line them all up, shoot them in a fire, basically like a firing squad, and then drag the bodies out.
All right. Okay, you're a Russian soldier. You're issued this order. You're staring down Anastasia, 12-year-old girl. How the fuck do you pull that trigger? Is it because the guy behind you will pull the trigger in the back of your head?
You're assuming that it's the Russian soldiers that are doing it. You're talking about people that are hardcore communists. These are people who are party members. This was not the average soldiers doing this.
These guys were fifth columnists before all of this. These are the guys that are running around destabilising shit, whispering in people's ears, organising rallies and stuff like that. They're heartless bastards.
These are the apparatchiks, for lack of a better term, all right, of the party. All right, these are the guys that do the dirty work of the party. What is going to become eventually the KGB. All right, that's who you're talking about. You're not talking about the average soldiers doing that. Now, you can make those kind of questions about the Nazis later on, all right? But the other thing to remember is you're talking about who these people are, what they've seen. They've seen children starve to death, literally starve to death, where they couldn't get enough to eat. These are people, that you talk about the deprivations and what they've gone through, all right? As far as the kind of lifestyle and can they just pull the trigger, these people are already broken to that point where, pulling the trigger on a 12-year-old girl, if she's a threat to the state, you pull the trigger.
Well, the son was only 6 years old, so something like that.
Yeah, I don't see any of that, but I'm not a zealot.
I think his son had died, though, in captivity, hadn't he?
I believe he died because wasn't Rasputin the one keeping him alive?
I think it's during their incarceration that their son actually he catches a. It's not that he dies of hemophilia; he dies of a disease, I think. So he's already dead by the time they order the entire liquidation of the royal family.
All right, so here's the thing. You have these cells all throughout the military. You have the peasant revolting. The Tsar's family is killed in its entirety, including the Tsar. Now, did they just shoot him, or did they make a grand show of it?
No, they shot. They didn't. They did it in secret and just announced later on that he had died. They didn't even admit initially. All right, that they were the ones that ordered the death.
It's literally as unceremoniously as if like a death squad walks into your place and lines you and your family up in your living room and just.
How would you? Okay, you're the Tsar. You ruled this country. You had ultimate power, and now you're staring down the barrel of a gun. What's your last thought?
Shouldn't have abdicated.
Basically, yeah.
The minute he abdicated, the minute he lost all power and authority and all this kind of stuff. So effectively, he was just another civilian at that point.
Instead of abdicating, he should have fled.
Mm.
That's what he. I guarantee you, that's what he was thinking.
Do you, or do you think his last thought was about his wife?
Well, I'm sure he's thinking about his wife and his kids and everything else, and the mistake that he made when in not being able to fix this.
Because you could also remember up until this point too, there really wasn't any sign that, like on his end of it, that they were going to be assassinated. They were sort of looked after. They were placed in a house. They were under guard and all this kind of stuff. They were effectively prisoners, but they weren't being treated they weren't being treated poorly. And there was probably the thought that like, oh well, we're probably going to live through this. We're not going to be free people, but we are not going to get lined up against the wall and get shot. And they did have guards like there to protect him, And I can't remember whether the communists either overpowered them or sent them away or something like that.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they were told to leave and they left.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I heard that one. But anyway, and it wasn't until he was staring down the barrel of a gun that was the point that he realised, well, shit, we're not going to live through this.
Yeah, I don't know.
As quick as that.
I think my last thought would have been, 1, I fucked up. 2, my wife and kids. You know what I mean? Like, I fucked up, and I didn't cost me my life. I costed them theirs.
I suspect that he probably was upset about that. I mean, it's one of the more unfortunate things that does happen. That happened.
Well, there was also probably every likelihood as well that the thought the rest of his family probably never occurred to him either, because it's typical that you'd kill the leader and not the rest of his family. So I'd suggest if they'd shot him first, they might have lined up the whole family, but they probably, he probably would have thought, oh, well, they're lining them up just to make sure that they don't get in the road kind of thing, but didn't realise maybe they did shoot him last, and then there's that point they were, oh fuck, they're going to wipe us all out.
The other thing that they did, which causes the Anastasia, rumors to do it, is the Russians announced that they had executed. They announced that Tsar Nicholas had died, right, and that they had executed him, but they didn't announce that his family had been executed. Because they knew it was not something that was going to go over well. All right, I mean, they were very circumspect about it. Okay, and that's typical of the Russians. I mean, that's typical of the Soviets. All right, on how they did things. Okay, it's unfortunate, but I mean, it's a tragedy. What happened to them? Did it need to happen? No. Okay, but you also got to look at the way the communists viewed things. Is if you were an enemy, eventually you were going to have to line up the bourgeoisie and shoot them all anyway, right?
I mean, you have a look at like the end of communism in the 90s, when all of a sudden Gorbachev goes missing. And basically the rumor was, well, we're never going to see Gorbachev again. If it wasn't for Yeltsin, we probably wouldn't have.
Well, that's probably very true. So, yeah, I mean, go ahead.
But I do want to do another stream tonight with you guys about all the stuff I've been missing, the great pandemic.
We can't talk about that.
40 in the Discord said that's his thing now. We can't do it. So fuck you. I'm going to do it.
That's what I said too.
Yeah, that's just how I roll. But the Russian Revolution, man. I know 45 minutes isn't really enough to get all the way through it, but really, I think we covered it fairly well in the broad sense of things. Because the way it shakes out comes months later, and we could retouch upon it, right?
Well, what we've also done is we've kind of illustrated the reasons why communism is frowned upon in most democratic parts of the world and all this kind of stuff, because this is how they get into power. This is the things that they'll do. They'll destabilize things. They'll prevent your country from doing what's right for you guys and all this, because remember, it wasn't just Russia and it wasn't just in Germany. They were even doing this in America. They were trying to halt America's war capability and all this kind of stuff, their general production and all this kind of stuff, and they were trying to seize power there. There's possibly at one point there where if they had gotten their way, you guys would have been communist and had your famine and all this kind of stuff and done the hard yards and whatnot. And just as say a business owner, for example, your production goes down, you lose, the command and control of your workers and all this kind of stuff for what? Some fuckwit that's just trying to destabilize a joint for pure anarchy, pretty much. and they completely ruined an entire country. They cost more lives than most other people. I mean, like, the beauty of communism is it kills a lot of communists, and that's the type of shit that they do. And this is the reason why we've been fighting back at them pretty much since the end of World War II.
Well, the advantage communism allows for, okay, the reason the communists maintained power in Russia for so long, right, is due to the fact that there's one thing that the communism is extraordinarily good for, and that is rapid changing your population over from an agrarian society into an industrial society. It's the best, most effective way for rapid industrialization of a society. Right. And it is effective. It works well. People forget this. The first 5-year plans, the first 2 to 3 5-year plans, when they talked about how they were going to, meet these different goals that they had, worked. It's just none of them worked after that. Okay. The first 15 years, they were able to take an agrarian society, a society where the vast majority of the populace worked the fields, were living on farms and working on farms, and turn them into an industrial state. It worked. All right. From that standpoint, it works. Now, what you've never seen is a society, a communist revolution happen, all right, in a society that's already industrialized. Mm-hmm. They only happen, all right, in areas where agriculture is the basic means of production.
These people are typically uneducated and they don't really know anything better.
Well, there could be a lot of reasons why it's happening, right? But the reality is that if you're going to industrialize, if you're going to change it into that kind of a state, that's how you do. It's an effective technique, and people will see these. Initially, they'll see the benefits. They'll say, "Oh, look, we're getting things we never had before. There's more tractors. There's more stuff that's coming out." So people think that this is a method that works, until it ends. All right. Now, an industrial state that's already there, they already know it doesn't work because it will have negative effects across the board, and people will see that almost immediately. And they'll say, okay, this isn't going to work because of because of the social dynamics that are involved in it. That's something to consider.
No, absolutely, and it definitely doesn't work in a military-industrial complex, which
Well, it can never work for a military. Militaries don't function very well with communist, the communist philosophy. All right, now the military itself can be used to support communism, all right, when you create the structures of rank and everything that are a part of it. The average people forget this. The idea that you were going to have everybody was a soldier and there's no rank structure. Bullshit. All right. The communists quickly learned that you couldn't do it that way. They created rank structures. You had majors, you had generals, you had basically officers that were assigned over the privates and so forth. Okay. The communist leadership isn't stupid. All right. And one of the things that they learned very quickly is as long as you've got the military and the military is being fed, okay, as long as you can control it, guess what? You're in charge.
No, absolutely. And what are we gonna do next week, guys?
Well, I think that we move on back into the months of what is it? Is it September, November, or is it November, December? Farting.
To be advised. I'm too tired to think at the moment.
Okay, and you're going to see the beginning. This is the preparation for the beginning of what the Russians are doing, because when the Russians quit, all right, the Germans are now starting to move their troops, all right, because they're planning an offensive now, all right, against the West. And they're going to try and build up that offensive before the military might of the United States can begin to tell. And so they're going to go on the offensive. They're going to move over Hindenburg, and they're moving Ludendorff. All right, they're removing all the leadership, basically, all right, of the German military in the West and placing them directly under Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And they're going to try the push, all right, the one final push to end the battle, to do it as quickly as possible. Now, that's what you're getting prepped to do. All right, they're going to start moving units. So that's what you've got to prep for.
All right. Well, we got a double header here. I'm going to be right back here in a few with the Red Eye. Talk a little bit about my trip and a little bit about you know what going on. Hope you got your mask and your gloves ready. Any last word, guys?
No, I think that's what we're prepared for. Farty, you need some sleep, probably, right?
I'll tell you in a minute.
All right. Later, guys.